The rain in Hell's Kitchen didn't just fall, it felt like a heavy, cold shroud descending over the city's filth. In a narrow, dead-end alleyway choked with the stench of rusted metal and wet garbage, Frank Costello stood perfectly still. He was leaning on his silver-headed cane, his grey overcoat immaculate despite the downpour. Behind him was a brick wall that had seen a century of misery. In front of him, the exit was blocked by four black and white cruisers, their sirens silent but their strobe lights slashing through the dark in violent bursts of red and blue. Standing 10 feet away was Police Chief Thomas Miller. He wasn't the kind of cop Costello usually dealt with, the kind with a price tag. Miller was a crusader, a man who had built his entire reputation on the promise of putting the Prime Minister in a cage. He held his service weapon with both hands, the muzzle leveled directly at Costello's chest. Behind him, 12 tactical officers stood with submachine guns at the ready. This wasn't a routine stop, it was an execution disguised as an arrest. "End of the line, Frank," Miller shouted over the thunder. "No lawyers this time. No judges in your pocket. You're in my world now, and in my world, you don't walk away. Get on your knees, or I'll let these boys turn your expensive coat into a sieve." Frank Costello didn't move a muscle. He didn't raise his hands, and he certainly didn't kneel. He reached into his pocket with a slow, deliberate grace that made the tactical team tense their fingers on their triggers. He pulled out a gold lighter and a single cigar. With the calm of a man sitting in a private lounge, he lit it, the flame steady even in the wind. He took a long, slow drag and exhaled a cloud of grey smoke into Miller's face. "You've spent 30 years trying to catch me, Thomas," Costello said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the alley. "And yet, here you are, standing in the rain, thinking that a piece of lead is going to change the order of this city. You didn't come here to arrest me. You came here because you're desperate. You came here because the chair you sit in is starting to feel very, very hot. If you're watching this and you think Costello is bluffing his way out of a firing squad, you haven't been paying attention. This is the overt takeover, the moment when the most powerful criminal in New York proves that the law is just a suggestion when you own the lawmakers. We are breaking down the badge audit, the most dangerous move in Costello's playbook." How did he know Miller would be in this exact alley tonight? What did Costello find in the chief's private records that turned a hero cop into a shivering wreck in seconds? And why are the 12 officers behind Miller starting to look at each other with fear instead of looking at their target? Hit that subscribe button right now if you want to see how a man without a gun can disarm an entire precinct. Like this video to show you're a fan of the Prime Minister's cold-blooded genius. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type "trap" in all caps. Let's see who's smart enough to spot the real predator. Now, let's go back to that rain-soaked alley, where Costello was about to reveal the chief's darkest secret. Miller stepped forward, the barrel of his gun inches from Costello's forehead. "I don't care about your speeches, Frank. You're going down. I have the witnesses, I have the ledgers, and I have the blood on your hands." Costello smiled, a thin, lethal curve of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. "You have nothing, Thomas. Because the men who gave you those witnesses? They work for me. The ledgers you found? I wrote them myself to lead you here." Costello leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Miller could hear. "But let's talk about your son, Thomas. Let's talk about the accident at the university last month. The hit and run that the local police buried so deep it reached the bedrock. You didn't wonder why the evidence vanished. You didn't wonder why the girl's family stopped screaming for justice." Miller's face went from a triumphant red to a deathly, translucent pale. The gun in his hand wavered for a fraction of a second. You have nothing to do with that," Miller choked out, his voice cracking. Costello took another puff of his cigar, the tip glowing like a demon's eye in the dark. "I have everything to do with it, Thomas. I paid the mechanics to crush the car. I paid the witnesses to move to Florida. And I'm the one who paid the judge to sign the non-disclosure agreements." Costello stepped even closer, pressing his own forehead against the cold steel of Miller's gun. "So here is the choice, Chief. You can pull that trigger and be a hero for 24 hours before my men release the original dashcam footage of your son's car hitting that girl. You'll be in a cell next to me by Tuesday, and your son? He won't survive the first night in Rikers. The atmosphere in the alley changed instantly. The 12 tactical officers, who were supposed to be Miller's elite guard, suddenly felt the shift in power. They saw their chief, the uncorruptible, beginning to crumble under the weight of a few whispered words. Costello turned his gaze away from Miller and looked at the officers behind him. "And you boys," Costello said, raising his voice so it carried over the rain. "Do you really think Miller is going to protect you when the feds start asking questions about the overtime pay you've been skimming from the docks? I know every one of your badge numbers. I know where your kids go to school. I am the one who keeps this city running." Not him. One by one, the submachine guns began to lower. Not because of a command, but because of a realization. They weren't standing behind a leader, they were standing behind a man who had already been conquered. Costello reached out and gently, almost mockingly, pushed the muzzle of Miller's gun away from his face. "You're not arresting me tonight, Thomas. In fact, you're going to give me a police escort to the Waldorf. And tomorrow morning, you're going to find a way to make those Genovese indictments disappear. Because if I'm not happy, nobody in this city gets to sleep." Miller stood there, his arm hanging limp at his side, the rain soaking through his uniform. He was the most powerful lawman in New York, and he had just been dismantled by a man with a cigar and a few sentences. He looked at Costello, and for the first time, he saw the Prime Minister for what he truly was, not a criminal, but the shadow ruler of the entire system. Costello began to walk toward the cruisers, his cane clicking on the pavement like a countdown. "Open the door, Thomas," Costello commanded without looking back. "It's cold out here, and we have a lot of work to do." As the police chief of New York slowly walked over to open the car door for the man he was supposed to destroy, the silence in the alley was absolute. The ambush had turned into a coronation. Frank Costello hadn't fired a single shot, but he had just captured the entire NYPD. But as the cars pulled away, Miller didn't know that the worst part was yet to come. Costello hadn't just saved Miller's son, he had used the boy to set a trap that would ensure Miller would be his puppet for the rest of his life. The ghost of Hell's Kitchen was now the master of the precinct, and the city was about to learn that the law was whatever Frank Costello said it was. The ride to the Waldorf Astoria was conducted in a silence so thick it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the limousine. Chief Miller sat across from Costello, staring at his own reflection in the tinted glass. He looked like a hollowed-out version of the man who had entered that alley. He was no longer a lawman, he was a passenger in his own downfall. Costello, meanwhile, was focused on a small manila folder he had pulled from a hidden compartment. He didn't look like a victor gloating, he looked like an accountant finishing a long day of auditing. "You're wondering about the footage, aren't you, Thomas?" Costello asked, not looking up from his papers. "You're wondering if I really have it? Or if I just played a very lucky hand in the dark?" Miller didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was a desert of dry fear. Costello slid a single photograph across the leather seat. It wasn't a shot of the accident. It was a photo of Miller's son, Danny, sitting in a diner, laughing and sharing a meal with one of Costello's most notorious enforcers. The date on the bottom of the photo was from 3 months before the accident. "I didn't just clean up your son's mess, Thomas," Costello whispered, finally meeting Miller's eyes. "I created the man who made the mess. I've been mentoring Danny for a year. I gave him the car. I gave him the lifestyle. And I gave him the girl who was in the crosswalk that night. The accident wasn't a tragedy, Thomas. It was an audition. And your son passed with flying colors. If you can feel the ice in your veins right now, then you are starting to see the true terrifying scale of the Prime Minister. Frank Costello doesn't just blackmail people, he engineers their lives so that they have no choice but to be blackmailed. This is the generational trap, the moment a father realizes his son isn't a victim, but an apprentice to his greatest enemy. How deep does this rabbit hole go? What did Costello promise Danny in exchange for his father's soul? And why is Miller about to realize that the police department he spent 30 years building is already a subsidiary of Costello Inc.? Hit that subscribe button right now to see the master of the long game in action. Like this video to show you understand that in New York, blood isn't thicker than water, it's thicker than ink. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type legacy in all caps. Let's see who understands the true cost of power. Now, let's get back to that limo, where the chief's world was about to vanish completely. The limousine pulled up to the Waldorf, but they didn't get out. Costello signaled the driver to keep circling the block. "You think you can just keep me on a leash, Frank?" Miller hissed, a spark of his old defiance flickering for a second. "The feds are already looking at the docks. If I stop the pressure, they'll notice. They'll come for both of us." Costello chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. "The feds only look where the lights are shining, Thomas. And starting tomorrow, you are going to shine the lights exactly where I tell you. You aren't going to stop the raids. You're going to increase them. But you're only going to hit the Genovese family. You're going to be the hero chief who finally broke the back of the Italian mob. You'll get the medals. You'll get the headlines. And I'll get their territory." The realization hit Miller like a physical blow. Costello wasn't asking for protection, he was asking for an army. He was turning the NYPD into his own private hit squad. Using the law to eliminate his competition. Every arrest Miller made from now on would be a strategic move on Costello's chessboard. Every heroic bust would be a hostile takeover disguised as justice. "You're insane," Miller whispered. "The city will burn." Costello leaned forward, his face inches from Miller's. "The city is already burning, Thomas. I'm just the only one standing here with a hose. You have two choices: you can be the man who tried to save a burning building and lost his family in the process, or you can be the man who helps me build a new one. A more organized one." Costello reached into his coat and pulled out a second badge, a gold shield that looked identical to Miller's. He placed it on the armrest between them. "This belonged to your predecessor, Chief O'Malley. Everyone thought he retired to Florida. The truth is, he's living on a private island in the Mediterranean that I bought for him 10 years ago. He was a smart man, Thomas. He understood that the badge is just a piece of tin. It's the man behind it that matters. He chose a life of luxury over a life of looking over his shoulder. What do you choose?" Miller looked at the badge, then at the photo of his son. He thought about the life he had built, the house in Westchester, the respect of his peers, all of it built on a foundation of sand that Costello had been slowly pouring water on for a decade. He realized that Danny wasn't just a pawn, Danny was the new king. If Miller fought, he would lose everything. If he surrendered, he would become the most powerful man in the city, second only to the man sitting across from him. The Prime Minister had audited Miller's life and found that his only remaining asset was his obedience. With a trembling hand, Miller picked up the gold shield. He didn't say a word, but the way he gripped it told Costello everything he needed to know. The deal was sealed in the dark, moving confines of a luxury car. "Good choice, Thomas," Costello said, leaning back and closing his eyes. "Now, tell the driver to take you back to the precinct. You have a press conference to prepare for. We have a lot of Genovese warehouses to clean up before sunrise." As Miller stepped out of the limo back at the precinct, his men were waiting for him. They looked at him with a mix of confusion and expectation, wondering what had happened in that alley. Miller stood tall, straightened his tie, and looked them in the eye. The transition was complete. The Crusader was dead, and the partner had been born. "Listen up!" Miller shouted, his voice booming with a newfound, dark authority. "We're changing the mission. We've been hitting the wrong targets. From now on, the Genovese family is our only priority. I want every man on double shifts. We're taking this city back." The precinct erupted in cheers. The officers thinking they were finally getting the green light to do their jobs. They didn't know they were now the muscle for Frank Costello. They didn't know that their hero chief was a man whose soul was being held in a manila folder in a Waldorf suite. And they certainly didn't know that Frank Costello was already watching them through the precinct's own surveillance cameras, which his janitors had hacked months ago. Back at the Waldorf, Costello stood on his balcony, looking down at the flickering lights of New York. He watched as a fleet of police cruisers sped out of the precinct, sirens wailing, heading toward the first of the Genovese coordinates. He took a long drag of his cigar and smiled. He had audited the law and found it wanting. He had audited the police and found them useful. And most importantly, he had audited the future and ensured it belonged to him. The Night of the Alley wasn't just a victory, it was a masterpiece. Frank Costello didn't need to be the mayor or the governor. Why bother with the title when you already own the man who holds the gun? The Prime Minister was in his castle, and the city was exactly where he wanted it, on its knees, begging for more.